remember the moment like it was scorched into my memory, my parents sitting on the couch, smug expressions softening into something that almost looked like pity, but not quite. I stood there at the edge of the living room, my hands clenched at my sides, heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to make a run for it. My father leaned back, his arms folded across his chest like he was about to deliver a lecture rather than drop a bomb on my life. His voice was calm, almost disturbingly so, when he said it. "We gave your wedding fund to your sister. She deserves it more." Just like that. No apology, no lead-up, no empathy. He might as well have announced what they were having for dinner. I didn't speak right away. My mother, ever the passive enabler in his shadow, nodded in agreement like this was some logical redistribution of wealth. Her lips curved in that serene, self-righteous smile she always wore when she was sure she was doing the right thing, even if it was twisted beyond belief. I was frozen, halfway between laughter and shock, but the anger was rising in my chest like a slow burn. My wedding fund. The money my grandmother had left for me, explicitly for me, stated in her will, underlined, emphasized. $50,000, sitting in a dedicated account for years, untouched, growing with interest. And now, just gone. I couldn't even form the words at first. My mind ran wild with every memory of sitting at that dining table with my grandmother, sipping sweet tea while she described all the little things she wanted to gift me for the big day. The lace veil from her own wedding she hoped I'd wear. The porcelain cake topper she had boxed up in the attic, saved for me since I was 12. She used to talk about my wedding as if it were some fairy tale she couldn't wait to help write. That money wasn't just money. It was her love, her vision, her legacy. And now my parents had gutted it and handed it over like it was theirs to reassign. "What do you mean, you gave it to Brianna?" I asked, finally, my voice low but shaking, like I was trying to keep something fragile from shattering inside me. My father just raised his chin and said, "She's getting married soon. You don't even have a fiancé." Like that somehow made it acceptable. Like my lack of a ring voided my right to something that had been promised to me my entire life. My mother chimed in with her usual thin-voiced logic, it just made more sense. Brianna is planning her wedding now. The timing aligned. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They were sitting there, acting like this was a practical transaction, like they were accountants balancing family spreadsheets instead of parents gutting their oldest daughter's future because it was convenient. It was like I was watching two people I'd known my whole life transform into strangers, right in front of me, all within the span of a single conversation. "She deserves it more," my dad had said. That line kept echoing in my head like a broken tape, each repetition peeling away the thin film of civility holding me together. What made her more deserving? Because she was younger? Prettier? Because she knew how to play the part of the perfect daughter, the one who batted her lashes and laughed at their dry jokes, who called them every other day and pretended to care about their garden updates. Or maybe because I'd always been the one who questioned them, who didn't play the role they had cast for me in their perfectly curated family tableau. I stood there, breathing hard, watching the way they looked at me like I was overreacting. My mom actually had the nerve to say, "You'll understand one day when you have children." As if that explained everything. As if betrayal becomes less gutting when you can justify it with your own twisted version of parental wisdom. I felt hollow, like my insides had just been scooped out with one sentence. I couldn't even cry, there was no room for tears with the rage flooding through every cell in my body. "That money wasn't yours to give," I said, my voice tight. "It was mine. She left it to me. Not you. Not Brianna. Me." My dad waved his hand like he was brushing off a fly. "It's all in the family. Brianna's wedding is for all of us. A celebration we can be proud of." Proud. That word made something snap. Proud of what? Favoring one child so blatantly the other might as well be erased from the family record? Proud of pretending this was some kind of collective victory instead of a blatant act of theft? I looked over at the framed photo on the mantel, me at my college graduation, standing between them, smiling because I thought they were proud of me. Now that smile felt like a lie. I wondered if they ever actually saw me for who I was or just the role they needed me to play until Brianna could step in and be the daughter they actually wanted. My mother reached out, as if trying to place a hand on mine. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," she said softly, and I pulled my hand away so fast it startled even me. Harder than it has to be. That's what she said. Like I was the problem. Like my grief was just another inconvenience in their calendar of wedding planning for the golden child. I walked out of that living room without another word. I could feel their eyes on my back, probably expecting me to get over it, to be the mature one, to swallow my bitterness and show up with a gift and a forced smile when the invitations came. But all I could think about was my grandmother. How she would have looked at them with that quiet disappointment she used to reserve for people who knew better but chose selfishness anyway. I didn't go back. I didn't call. I didn't write. Because at that moment, standing in the aftermath of that betrayal, I realized something that changed me forever. Sometimes the worst betrayals don't come from enemies. They come wrapped in family photos, with smiles that don't reach the eyes, and sentences that begin with, "We did what was best." When Carter spoke, the entire room changed. My father had just finished one of his tired speeches about how family sacrifices sometimes require hard choices, while Brianna scrolled through her phone with that smug little half-smile that made me want to scream. But Carter, standing beside me with his hands clasped behind his back, didn't raise his voice. He didn't even shift his posture. He just said it, flat and precise, like he was reading off a weather forecast, "You have 96 hours to return every cent. Every dollar. All of it." My mother blinked like she had misheard him. My father sat forward in his chair, his eyebrows bunching into that look he gave waiters when the food was late, and Brianna snorted a short laugh that came out like a bark of disbelief. Carter didn't react. His face was unreadable, calm, poised, almost terrifying in its restraint. He didn't look at me, didn't glance toward the ground, didn't shift his weight. His gaze remained locked on my father's, unwavering and unblinking, and there was something in his eyes that made even my father's practiced arrogance falter for a moment. He said it again, slowly this time, enunciating every word like he wanted no room for misunderstanding. "This isn't a threat. It's a courtesy." I had never seen him like that before. Not even during the worst moments of our engagement planning, not even when his company had gone through a messy restructuring and he was working 20-hour weeks. This wasn't anger. This wasn't pride. It was clarity, the kind that comes when someone has been pushed past politeness, past empathy, and into a place of pure, focused resolve. And it was in that moment that I realized the full gravity of what was happening. Carter wasn't asking for permission, and he wasn't seeking justice. He was laying down terms. My father scoffed and leaned back into the couch, trying to regain his sense of superiority. "You think you can come into my home and start barking orders about money that wasn't even yours to begin with?" His tone was laced with mockery, but his fingers tapped the armrest too quickly, betraying his nerves. "That money was meant for a wedding. Well, Brianna's getting married. Seems like it's being used exactly as intended." Carter didn't flinch. "The money was earmarked by her grandmother, in her will, for Kayla's wedding. There is documented intent, and your misappropriation of those funds is not just immoral, it's provable." His voice was as still as glass. "You have 96 hours to make it right." Brianna rolled her eyes and let out a sharp laugh. "Okay, so what? You're going to sue us? Over some family drama?" Her tone dripped with sarcasm, but she wasn't looking directly at him anymore. She was looking at me, expecting me to laugh it off, to minimize him, to explain him away like some overprotective fiancé with a bruised ego. But I didn't move. I was frozen, not in fear, but in something closer to awe. I had spent my entire life watching my family bend and twist people into submission, guilt-tripping them, shaming them, making them feel selfish for wanting what they had earned. But Carter didn't shrink. He didn't explain himself. He didn't raise his voice to match theirs. He just stood there, cold and still, like the storm wasn't coming, he was the storm. "I'm not interested in theatrics," he continued, turning slightly now, addressing all of them at once. "I'm not here to argue. I'm not going to play the role of the angry outsider who wants to tear apart your precious little narrative. I'm just stating a fact. You misused inheritance funds. You have 96 hours to restore the account in full. If you do not, the next conversation we have will be with legal representation present." Simple as that. There was silence. Thick, oppressive silence. The kind that swells up in a room when something real has just happened, something that cuts deeper than anyone wants to admit. My father opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. My mother looked down at her lap, her fingers tracing an invisible pattern on the hem of her sweater. Brianna was the only one who still tried to maintain that brittle bravado, but her smile had faded, and the flush rising up her neck betrayed the quiet panic she was trying to hide. I glanced at Carter, and in that moment I saw everything in him I had once overlooked. The lawyer's mind, precise and unyielding. The man who never raised his voice because he never needed to. The one who kept a ledger of wrongs, not out of spite, but because justice demanded it. I remembered all the nights I had cried in his arms over my parents, over Brianna, over feeling like I was the spare part in my own family, and how he had never once told me to let it go or be the bigger person. He just held me and said, "That's not right. And one day, you won't let them get away with it." That day was now. I watched the facade crumble in slow motion, my father's carefully constructed role as the benevolent patriarch, my mother's subtle moral superiority, Brianna's smug entitlement, and in its place, I saw fear. Not panic. Not the kind of terror that comes from immediate danger. No, this was a quieter, colder fear. The realization that, for the first time in their lives, they might actually be held accountable. That someone had drawn a line they couldn't cross without consequence. Carter checked his watch, not because he was impatient, but because he wanted them to feel it, that time was ticking, that they were no longer in control of the narrative. He turned toward the door and said, "We'll be leaving now. You have our number. I suggest you use it before the deadline." Then, without another glance, he stepped out of the living room. I followed, my pulse thrumming in my ears, the air behind me thick with everything unspoken. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Because I knew what I'd see, my family, stuck in the wreckage of their own entitlement, trying to figure out how everything had shifted so fast, so completely, and so far beyond their control. 96 hours. That was all they had left. The drive home was silent except for the soft hum of the tires against the road and the occasional click of Carter's turn signal. I stared out the window, eyes fixed on the nothingness of passing lights and fading neighborhoods, but my mind was racing in loud, suffocating loops. I couldn't stop replaying every moment from my childhood where my needs were brushed aside like afterthoughts, each one resurfacing now with brutal clarity as if they had just happened. The sting of a forgotten birthday. The hollow smile my mother gave me when she handed me a combined Christmas gift because Brianna's wish list had been longer. The summer I begged to attend the language immersion program in Spain, the one I'd worked so hard to qualify for, only to be told that there weren't enough funds that year, and then 3 weeks later watching Brianna fly off to an acting camp in California, complete with new luggage and a send-off party. I remembered the day I broke my wrist falling off the swing in our backyard. I was maybe 10, maybe 11, crying and cradling my arm as my father loaded us into the car, only to make an unexpected stop at the dance studio to drop off Brianna's forgotten ballet shoes. I sat in the back seat in pain for nearly 40 minutes while they chatted with her instructor and praised her new routine. When we finally got to the hospital, the nurse had to peel my fingers away from my swollen wrist. My mother didn't even seem to notice. I told myself it was just a one-off. But it wasn't. There was always something. Always some reason I had to wait, or adjust, or be understanding of Brianna's needs. Her anxiety. Her confidence. Her potential. It was as if every opportunity in our house came with a silent tag that said, "For Brianna only," and I was just borrowing space. I'd learned early to hide my jealousy, to package it as maturity. They said I was the strong one, the quiet one, the easy one. What they meant was I was the one they could ignore without a fuss. And now, here it was again. Not a missed birthday or an overlooked school award. This time, it was my wedding. Something sacred. Something I had talked about with my grandmother for years, how she had put aside that money not just for the event, but to make sure I had something beautiful in my life, something just for me, something no one else could take. A cushion of joy she carved out of her savings and left behind for the one granddaughter she saw being constantly sidelined. I could still hear her voice in my head, "Don't let anyone tell you you're second, Kayla." Not ever. She had died 2 years ago. I never got to tell her how much those words meant to me. I don't think I truly understood it until now. I felt the burn in my throat and blinked hard, refusing to let the tears fall. I wasn't 12 anymore, and I wasn't going to dissolve into sobs in the passenger seat while Carter was trying to navigate late-night traffic. But inside, I was shaking. With grief, with rage, with this painful realization that I had been carrying the weight of second place my entire life and calling it love. I had swallowed so much disappointment under the name of family, so many quiet letdowns I had tucked into the corners of my memory just to survive being in that house. Carter's fingers tightened slightly on the steering wheel, not enough to be obvious, but I noticed. He hadn't said much since we left, but I could feel it radiating off of him, the same tension that had been in his voice when he gave my family that 96-hour ultimatum. It wasn't performative. It wasn't empty fury. It was protection, sharpened into action. And somehow, knowing that he was as angry as I was, but measured, calm, deliberate, made me feel more seen than I ever had in that damn house. I turned to him, finally breaking the silence, my voice low but steady. They've been doing this my whole life. He didn't interrupt. I went on. Every time something was supposed to be mine, it went to Brianna. I kept thinking, maybe next time, maybe when I'm older, maybe if I just don't make a scene, but it never changed. And now they took this. My voice cracked. They took my grandmother's gift. The one thing that was supposed to be safe. Carter nodded slowly, keeping his eyes on the road, but I could feel his jaw tighten. They didn't just take the money. They took her memory and twisted it into convenience. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. They thought you'd stay quiet. They've trained you to. The truth of it hit like a slap, but I didn't flinch. I just sat with it, letting the silence thicken around us again. I thought about how many times I had apologized for having feelings. How many times I'd stayed up late helping Brianna with homework while my mother thanked her for being so self-reliant. How many times I'd been told I was overreacting when I said I felt overlooked. I remembered once, in high school, when I won a state essay competition. My parents congratulated me by saying, "That's great, honey, but let's not make Brianna feel bad. She's going through a rough patch." And that was it. That was the celebration. The difference now was that I wasn't a child anymore, and Carter wasn't going to let them push me into silence again. I wasn't standing alone at the edge of the room watching everyone toast Brianna's accomplishments. I wasn't the girl brushing off hurt with a fake smile. I was a woman who had finally run out of space for excuses. They thought they were doing what they always did, taking something from me under the guise of family. They didn't realize the version of me they had trained to tolerate, to comply, to adapt, didn't live here anymore. Carter glanced at me briefly before returning his eyes to the road. They won't win this time. They're not ready for what happens when you finally say no. I didn't say anything back. I didn't have to. Because somewhere between the house I left behind and the future I was now gripping with both hands, something inside me had shifted, permanently, irreversibly. I wasn't going to shrink to make room for Brianna anymore. I wasn't going to let their twisted version of fairness smother what was mine. This time, I was done being second place. And they were about to find out what that meant. When we got back to the apartment, the door had barely closed behind us before Carter reached for his phone. He didn't take off his coat. He didn't sit down. He just walked to the edge of the kitchen counter, pulled up a single number, and pressed call. His voice was calm, clipped, and low when the line connected. "Activate the backup," he said simply, as if he'd just confirmed a dinner reservation or ordered a package, and then he ended the call without waiting for a response. No explanation, no discussion. Just a single command that I somehow knew had weight behind it, though I didn't yet understand the scale. I stood by the doorway, arms still wrapped around my chest like I was trying to hold in whatever was left of my composure, watching him with this tight feeling building in my throat. I didn't even know what backup he was referring to. We had spent weeks trying to plan this wedding around what my family wanted. My mother had inserted herself into every conversation, overridden every choice I made, suggested venues that suited her vision, not mine. I had let it happen, told myself it was easier that way, told myself she was just excited. But Carter, it turned out, hadn't just been watching. He had been preparing. I leaned against the counter across from him and asked, not angrily, but quietly, "What backup?" He looked up at me then, and there was a different kind of resolve in his face, not the hard lines of confrontation he'd worn at my parents' house, but something steadier. A sort of quiet, anchored certainty. "The one I started building the moment your mother tried to turn our wedding into her second chance at a debutante ball," he said. I blinked, trying to process what he meant, and Carter, finally, took off his coat, folding it over the back of the chair like this was just another Tuesday. "Thomas is a logistics director at the firm," he continued, his tone calm, factual, like we were talking about scheduling a meeting. "He's handled multi-million-dollar international events. Wedding coordination is child's play for him. I looped him in after your mom's third email trying to replace the photographer we'd already chosen. Every time she made a change, I mirrored it with a real plan. Real vendors. Real contracts. No strings tied to your family. Just us. I was stunned. Not because I didn't believe he was capable of it, Carter lived in details, ran his life like an executive would run a boardroom, but because it meant he had seen all of it happening. Every subtle move my mother made to push me out of my own wedding, every time I said, "It's fine," when it wasn't. He hadn't argued with me about it then. He hadn't tried to force me to stand up to her when I wasn't ready. He had just prepared. For me. For us. "There's a venue outside the city," he said, unlocking his iPad and pulling up documents like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Private estate. No public listings. Full exclusivity. Booked under a shell name. The vendors are confirmed, including the ones you originally wanted. The florist, the string quartet, the bakery that made your grandmother's favorite lemon cake. They've all been on standby." I sat down slowly on the edge of the couch, unable to speak for a moment. I felt this strange rush of emotions, gratitude, disbelief, grief over everything that had just happened, and this overwhelming sense of safety I hadn't realized I'd been missing. Carter walked over and sat beside me, the iPad now showing a full layout of the property, floor plans, logistics, booking confirmations, timeline schedules. "It's all here," he said, tilting the screen so I could see. "A wedding that actually belongs to you. Not your mother. Not your sister. You." I didn't even realize I was crying until I tasted the salt on my lips. Carter didn't say anything. He just reached over and took my hand, threading our fingers together in that effortless way he always did when he knew I was unraveling. No pressure. No commentary. Just presence. The truth was, I had felt this moment coming for a long time. My family had always tried to control the narrative, curating every holiday, every photograph, every story they told about themselves. My mother, especially, was obsessed with appearances. She wanted a daughter with the perfect wedding to match the perfect image she had crafted of our family. But the perfection was always brittle, always built on ignoring reality. And when I didn't fit the image she wanted, when I pushed back even slightly, she either guilted me into silence or twisted the story until I became the unreasonable one. But now, I was staring at concrete proof that Carter had never bought into that performance. While I had been second-guessing myself, he had been quietly building a parallel plan that didn't depend on anyone's approval except mine. He had paid attention to the songs I wanted to walk down the aisle to, the menu I loved, the florist I'd bookmarked a year before we were even engaged. He had known, long before I admitted it out loud, that the wedding I was planning with my family wasn't mine. It was theirs. And so he had made another one. "I didn't tell you," he said after a long pause, "because I didn't want you to feel like you had to choose before you were ready. But I knew, eventually, they'd cross a line that couldn't be undone. And I wanted you to know that we'd still have a way forward. A way that's ours." I looked at him then, really looked at him, and I saw it all, the quiet work, the strategic thinking, the love he never needed to perform because it was always built into everything he did. While I was busy trying not to upset anyone, he was building a way to protect my joy. Not as a favor. Not as some white knight performance. But because he knew I deserved it. Because he knew how much had already been taken from me by people who claimed to love me. The betrayal at my parents' house still burned, but it wasn't the end of the story. Not this time. Not with Carter sitting beside me, the blueprints of a wedding that was mine glowing from the screen between us. My mother had tried to take everything, but she hadn't realized Carter had already built the exit door. And we were about to walk through it, together. 3 days passed, and the silence from my family was almost deafening. No phone calls. No texts. No attempts to explain or even justify what they had done. Just this cold, gaping void where accountability should have been. I kept checking my phone like an idiot, not because I expected remorse, but because some small, pathetic part of me still hoped that someone, my mother, my father, even Brianna, would acknowledge what had happened. That they would realize how cruel it was to take something that didn't belong to them and then pretend it was justified. But instead, the hours kept crawling by with nothing but that thick silence pressing against my chest, tightening every time I looked at my notifications and saw nothing but the usual spam and work emails. On the third night, as I sat on the couch with a blanket wrapped around me and the glow of Carter's laptop casting soft shadows across the room, my phone buzzed with a single incoming message. I knew the tone before I even opened it, something in the way my chest tightened told me it wasn't an apology. It was from my mother. A paragraph-long message, carefully punctuated, her signature tone laced in performative concern but dripping with passive aggression. She didn't apologize. She didn't mention the money. She didn't even acknowledge the reality of what had happened. Instead, she wrote, "Kayla, I'm disappointed in how you handled yourself. Your outburst was inappropriate and completely unnecessary. You embarrassed the family and made things 10 times harder for your sister. I think you owe us all an apology." I just sat there for a moment, staring at the screen, my fingers curled tightly around the phone, my jaw clenched so hard it hurt. An apology. From me. After they stole from me. After they rewrote the story to paint me as the ungrateful one. It was like she had reached into my chest, pulled out the last shred of hope I had for decency, and crushed it with one well-practiced line of manipulation. No mention of the $50,000. No mention of my grandmother. Just a demand that I, once again, silence myself to preserve their image. Not long after, another message came through, this time from my father. His style was different. Shorter. Sharper. "You've always had a tendency to overreact. I thought you'd grown out of it. Family means compromise, Kayla. You should think about the pressure your sister's under right now. Is this really the time to add more tension?" And there it was. Not just denial, but a masterclass in emotional guilt. They weren't sorry. They weren't even remotely sorry. They were angry at me for not playing along. They were more offended by Carter's calm, measured boundary than by their own blatant theft. In their eyes, I hadn't been betrayed, I had been disobedient. And that, to them, was the real crime. I didn't respond. I didn't scream or cry or type out the angry essay boiling in my brain. I just got up, walked over to Carter, who was sitting at the kitchen table reviewing floor plans for the alternate venue, and I placed the phone face up beside him without a word. He looked up at me briefly, then down at the messages. His eyes moved across the screen with that slow, precise calm that I'd come to associate with him preparing for war. He read both texts, then set the phone down without even blinking. His voice was quiet, almost soft, but there was steel beneath it. "The clock is still ticking." He didn't need to say anything else. Because in that moment, I knew exactly what he meant. The deadline stood. The window for decency, for correction, for owning up to what they had done, it was still open, but it was closing. And with each second they spent trying to rewrite the narrative and recast me as the problem, that window was narrowing. I didn't feel conflicted anymore. I didn't feel heartbroken or unsure or hesitant. I felt clear. I felt anchored. And above all, I felt done. I thought of all the times they had gaslit me in the past, told me I was too sensitive, that I misunderstood, that I needed to let things go for the sake of the family. I had internalized those messages for years, bent myself in half to accommodate their comfort, taught myself to shrink every time they got defensive. But this time, there was no shrinking. There was just the sharp edge of reality cutting through every illusion I had once clung to. They had stolen from me, and when I had the audacity to call it what it was, they demanded I apologize for speaking the truth. And Carter, my calm, methodical, unshakable Carter, wasn't going to let them get away with it. Not because he needed revenge. Not because of pride. But because he understood something my family never had, I deserved to be treated like I mattered. And this time, I wasn't going to let anyone tell me otherwise. It was hour 92 when my phone rang, and I knew the moment I saw my father's name that this wasn't going to be an apology, a confession, or any real attempt at reconciliation. It was going to be a performance, one final act in a long, exhausting play where I was expected to return to my assigned role, silent, reasonable, grateful even for being told that I was less important than the daughter they had already crowned in their minds as the one worth sacrificing for. I didn't hesitate. I answered the call and held the phone to my ear in silence, waiting, letting him speak first. His voice was clipped, formal, cold in that measured way he always used when he was certain he was right. There was no warmth, no shame, not even hesitation. Just that signature tone that had once been used to lecture me about respect and responsibility and keeping my emotions in check. "Kayla," he began, not asking how I was, not acknowledging the deadline, not even attempting to bridge the chasm they had created. "Let's be honest. The money's gone. Deposits have been paid. The venue is secured, the catering is finalized, dresses have been ordered. There's no reversing it now." I said nothing. My fingers dug into the arm of the couch as I stared straight ahead at the city lights outside our apartment window, listening to him speak as if he were discussing inventory or balancing a budget. It wasn't just the words, it was the complete absence of regret that gutted me. They hadn't just taken the money. They had spent it. Willingly. Eagerly. With full knowledge of where it came from and who it was meant for. And now, with less than 4 hours left on the clock, he was calling not to make amends, but to justify the theft with logic he thought I would find acceptable. You don't need it, he continued, and that was the moment something inside me went still. That one sentence, that quiet, definitive judgment about what I did or didn't deserve. You're marrying into wealth, he added, his voice hardening. You're going to be fine. Your sister needs this more than you do. This wedding is important for her future, her stability, her confidence. She needs to feel celebrated right now. You'll understand one day. There it was. The line I'd heard in a dozen forms over the course of my life. She needs it more. You'll understand one day. Be the bigger person. Sacrifice for the family. Give more. Take less. Stay quiet. Don't make trouble. I felt the words stack on top of each other like bricks, building the same wall I had spent years trying to climb. And now, hearing him justify all of it with the ease of someone who believed this decision was righteous, I felt something deeper than rage. I felt clarity. When he finally stopped speaking, when the weight of his justification had been laid bare and the silence returned to the line, I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't plead for understanding or try to make him see what he had destroyed. I just breathed in, steady and controlled, and spoke one sentence. My voice was flat, emotionless, but final. You have 4 hours left. That was it. No negotiation. No attempt to explain. Just a deadline, the same one Carter had issued days ago, the same one they had chosen to ignore. And then I ended the call. The silence after I hung up was louder than the call itself. I sat there with the phone in my hand, staring at the screen for a few seconds before setting it down gently on the table. I didn't shake. I didn't feel unsteady. I felt clean. Like something heavy had been cut away. A part of me had spent my entire life waiting for my family to see me, to choose me, to finally recognize me as more than the filler between their favorite daughter's highlight reels. But this moment, this call, stripped away every illusion I had left. They weren't confused. They weren't overwhelmed. They weren't doing their best. They had made a choice. They chose to fund Brianna's fantasy with my inheritance. They chose to turn my grandmother's legacy into leverage for their own comfort. They chose to ignore every word Carter had said, every line I had drawn, every moment of dignity I had tried to preserve. And when faced with the consequences of that choice, they reached for their favorite weapon, emotional manipulation wrapped in false logic. But this time, I wasn't that girl anymore. I wasn't 12, watching Brianna unwrap another expensive gift while being told my birthday would be low-key this year. I wasn't 15, sitting in the passenger seat outside the with a broken wrist while they dropped off Brianna's things first. I wasn't 22, smiling politely while my mother redesigned my graduation party to match her taste and Brianna's schedule. I was a grown woman, about to get married, about to build a life on my terms, with a man who saw me clearly and had never once asked me to shrink. And I was done playing the role they wrote for me. The final straw wasn't the money. It wasn't even the lie. It was that phone call, hearing my father tell me, without hesitation, that my value was conditional. That because I had found a man who worked hard, who came from privilege, who built a stable future with me, I was no longer allowed to want anything. That being loved disqualified me from being wronged. That I had enough, and therefore I was expected to keep giving to the people who had taken from me over and over again without shame. Carter walked into the room a few minutes later, probably having heard the end of the call from the hallway, and sat down beside me. I didn't have to say anything. He looked at me, saw the quiet in my face, and understood. I hadn't just drawn the line. I had walked over it. And I wasn't going back. At the 96th hour, Carter executed everything with the precision of someone who had been waiting, quietly and patiently, for this exact moment. There was no drama, no grand announcement, no vindictive outburst. Just a simple call, a few swift confirmations, and then the entire illusion that my mother had tried so desperately to control unraveled with surgical efficiency. The country club she had insisted on, her crown jewel, the one she had boasted about to every woman in her yoga group, the venue she called refined and traditional, with that tight smile that masked her need to be seen, was cancelled. The email went out that morning, crisp and final, terminating all arrangements. Deposits were forfeited without hesitation. Carter didn't blink. He wasn't looking to reclaim lost costs. He was focused on cutting every string they had attached to our day. And in that single decision, I felt something uncoil inside me, something that had been tangled for years, my willingness to perform, to accommodate, to carry my family's expectations like a weight on my back disguised as duty. The new venue was everything my mother would have hated, intimate, bold, and unfiltered by the pretense of legacy country club culture. It was a restored 1920s ballroom in the heart of the city, lined with tall arched windows that flooded the space with natural light and revealed the skyline just beyond the river. The walls were textured with century-old stonework, warm gold accents, and hand-carved columns. Nothing about it screamed opulence. It whispered history, intention, and quiet elegance. It wasn't a place to be seen. It was a place to be present. Every vendor was replaced. The ones she had strong-armed us into choosing, photographers who specialized in glossy staged portraits, a florist who spoke only to her, a caterer who mocked my preference for a vegetarian menu, gone. In their place were people I had chosen, or Carter had found by listening to me during those late-night conversations when I didn't even realize he was taking notes. The bakery that made the lemon cake my grandmother used to order every spring now had our wedding date circled on their calendar. The florist I had once followed obsessively on social media, who filled every bouquet with wild arrangements that looked like they had just been gathered from an untouched hillside, was now building a custom design. There were no mirrored tables, no stiff white linens, no generic monograms. There were hand-pressed menus, deep green linens, candlelight, and music chosen from the playlists I used to dream to before any of this was real. And then there was the guest list. It wasn't just edited, it was gutted. My parents, gone. Brianna, gone. The rotating cast of family friends, business associates, distant relatives whose names I barely remembered but who my mother had insisted were crucial for optics, every single one of them erased without ceremony. Carter and I sat at the kitchen table for hours the night before, each with a pen in hand, not asking who we had to invite, but asking only one question: who do we genuinely want to celebrate with? That list was shorter than I expected. But it was honest. And when we finished, the names on that list didn't represent obligation or tradition. They represented love, loyalty, memory, friendship. People who had chosen us even when it wasn't easy. The shift was immediate. I could feel it in the atmosphere, in the way my body moved through the decisions, in how I no longer flinched at the thought of invitations being sent. The wedding no longer felt like a production I had to endure. It didn't feel like a spectacle built to please an audience that never saw me. It felt like something entirely new, not smaller, but more grounded. More real. I found myself breathing easier, standing straighter. There was no one left to impress. Only people left to include. It was the first time that I could look at my wedding and see myself in it, not as an accessory, not as a vessel for someone else's aesthetic, not as a placeholder for my mother's unfulfilled dreams or a supporting character in my sister's endless spotlight, but as the main presence. My voice. My vision. My boundaries. Every detail felt like a quiet reclamation of things I had once believed were out of my reach. Carter didn't ask for praise. He didn't gloat. He moved through each step of the process like someone honoring a promise, not just to me, but to the version of me that had lived under the thumb of family dynamics for too long. The girl who had been taught to shrink herself to keep the peace. The woman who now refused to. And as the final confirmations rolled in, the calendar flipped to the date we had chosen, and the guest list came together into something that actually felt human, I realized I wasn't just planning a wedding anymore. I was standing inside a moment of clarity that had taken my entire life to reach. They had tried to make this day about them. They had stolen, manipulated, rewritten, and erased. But I had taken it back. Every single piece. And in doing so, I found something I didn't know I had the right to want. A wedding that finally felt like mine. I should have expected the backlash, but nothing really prepares you for the moment your own family turns the truth into a weapon and swings it at you in public. Not content with silence or the dignity of letting things unravel quietly, my parents decided to double down. On the morning after the 96-hour deadline passed without a single cent returned or even acknowledged, Carter's parents called us, voices tight with disbelief. My mother and father had shown up at their doorstep unannounced. No text, no call, just the two of them standing on the manicured front lawn like door-to-door missionaries of revisionist history, demanding to be heard. Carter's father, polished, kind, but allergic to drama in all forms, opened the door and listened to exactly 60 seconds of my father's self-righteous monologue before stepping outside and firmly shutting it behind him. "You're not welcome here," he said, not cruelly, but with that unmistakable edge that comes from someone who has worked their entire life to surround their family with decency. He made it clear that Carter had already shared everything. That they knew where the money came from, who it was intended for, and what had been done with it. My parents tried to spin it, my mother reportedly saying, "They're young, they don't understand how families work. Sacrifices have to be made," to which Carter's mother responded, "You didn't sacrifice. You stole." They were asked to leave the property immediately. When Carter told me this, I didn't react. I didn't need to. There was nothing left to process, only a grim sort of relief that someone else had finally seen the reality I had grown up with. The control, the entitlement, the manipulation buried under faux civility. But that was only the beginning. Brianna, predictably, took it public. She posted on every platform she could, long captions dripping with vague references and not-so-subtle jabs, carefully curated photos of her wedding planning binders, screenshots of texts without context, and captions that painted her as the victim of my alleged cruelty. She called me selfish. Spoiled. A jealous sister who couldn't stand seeing someone else in the spotlight. She used words like entitled and vindictive to describe me. She said I was weaponizing money to punish our parents and ruining a family legacy over a few wedding details. And for the first hour, I admit, it hurt. Not because I believed it, but because I knew how easily people online could be manipulated by surface-level narratives. Because I knew she had always been better at public performance than I ever wanted to be. But something remarkable happened next. The story didn't stick. People started asking questions. Mutual friends, extended family members, even distant acquaintances, all of them began reaching out privately. Some were cautious, others direct. "Did your parents really take your inheritance for her wedding? I thought your grandmother left that money to you. Why would they do that and then expect you to stay silent?" I didn't post a single thing in response. I didn't have to. The truth had already started leaking into the cracks of their carefully constructed lie. Because once you strip away the noise, the facts remain. The money wasn't theirs. It was mine. And they took it anyway. The real shift came when Brianna's fiancé's family caught wind of it. Apparently, someone in his cousin's circle saw her posts, followed the breadcrumbs, and reached out to an old classmate of mine who confirmed the story. That money had been allocated in my grandmother's will, designated specifically for my future wedding, held in trust for me by my parents until the time came. A trust that, without my consent, they drained and funneled into a different wedding entirely. The trust fund account wasn't even closed out properly, it had been accessed under the justification of family emergency expenditures. Legally murky. Ethically devastating. From what I heard later, the confrontation at Brianna's fiancé's house was quiet, but brutal. His parents, respectable, conservative, private, sat her down and asked direct, uncomfortable questions about the money. About why her wedding was being funded with inheritance meant for someone else. About why there were no records of her family ever contributing anything financially to their own daughter's event, but plenty of receipts showing where mine had disappeared. She panicked, of course. Claimed she didn't know. Claimed it wasn't her fault. Claimed it was all a misunderstanding, that I had overreacted. But by then, the damage was already done. The whispers grew louder. The wedding vendors Carter and I had cancelled, some of whom had already heard the story from the industry grapevine, started backing us in quiet solidarity. One of them even reached out to say, "I knew something was off with your mom from the beginning. I'm glad you got out." Friends I hadn't spoken to in years sent messages saying how proud they were of me for standing up for myself. A distant cousin emailed me a scanned copy of a letter my grandmother had once written about how proud she was that I was graceful, even when invisible. I sat on the edge of the bed that night, phone buzzing with incoming messages I didn't feel the need to respond to, and let the weight of it all settle in. For once, I wasn't explaining myself. I wasn't defending my character. I wasn't begging to be understood. The facts were speaking for themselves. And the people who needed to see them were finally listening. My family tried to spin a lie they had spent years rehearsing, that I was ungrateful, dramatic, difficult. But the truth had too many witnesses now. And no matter how loudly they shouted, they couldn't change the facts. They had chosen to erase me to uplift Brianna. And in doing so, they had exposed themselves. The consequences didn't come like an explosion. They came like erosion, slow at first, almost imperceptible, then suddenly everything they had built began to cave in. They thought there wouldn't be consequences because there never had been. My silence had always been their shield. For years, I absorbed the blows, adjusted, forgave, swallowed resentment until it made a home in my body. But this time, I didn't bend. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I simply stepped out of their carefully constructed narrative, and when I did, the whole thing started to unravel. It began with Carter's father. He wasn't the kind of man who involved himself in drama. He didn't raise his voice or issue threats. But he had spent decades building a reputation for integrity, and he moved through rooms where people listened closely when he spoke. And when he found out how my family had taken money from a legal trust meant for me, misrepresented it, spent it, then doubled down with lies and public humiliation, he didn't get angry. He made a few quiet phone calls. One of those calls reached the chairman of the board at the hospital where my father had spent most of his career. My father had always carried himself like a man untouchable within those halls, his voice louder than most, his opinions always inserted into conversations whether invited or not. For years, he had hovered on the edge of a board promotion that would have placed him in a position of serious influence. That promotion disappeared almost overnight. No explanation. Just a polite but final email thanking him for his service and informing him that the decision had been made to move in a different direction. Behind closed doors, there was murmuring about ethics. About personal conduct. About the optics of stealing from one daughter to fund another's social event and pretending it was a family matter rather than a breach of trust. He didn't take it well. I heard through an old family friend that he ranted in meetings, blamed vindictive outsiders, and claimed it was politically motivated. But no one stood up for him. People were polite, but distant. The tide had shifted. My mother's fall was less dramatic, but in many ways more telling. Her interior design business had always been about appearances. She sold curated luxury to women in their 50s who wanted their homes to feel like magazine spreads. Most of her business came through referrals and social reputation. And suddenly, those referrals dried up. Clients ghosted her. New inquiries vanished. Long-standing partnerships dissolved without explanation. No scandal. No headlines. Just silence. She called it a market shift, blamed the economy, but I knew what it really was. Reputation is currency in that world. And hers had just tanked. And then there was Brianna. She had always performed well in public. Always known how to command attention, how to spin victimhood into sympathy. But this time, the sympathy never arrived. Her online smear campaign didn't generate the validation she expected. The narrative collapsed under its own weight. And once her fiancé's family uncovered the truth, every dollar spent, every lie told, every attempt to disguise theft as support, they didn't waste time. They pulled the engagement. I wasn't there when it happened, but someone close to his family told me later how it went down. A quiet dinner. A straightforward conversation. A final question asked directly to Brianna, "Did you know the money was meant for your sister?" She tried to sidestep it, tried to frame it as family politics, but they had seen the receipts. They had read the documents. They knew. Within a week, the ring was returned. The venue was cancelled. And she was alone. My mother, desperate to salvage what was left, tried to rewrite the entire story again, told people I had always been difficult, that I had forced Carter into legal threats, that I had turned our family against itself. But people were tired. They saw the pattern. You can't fake innocence when the pieces don't add up, and for the first time, people were doing the math on their own. I watched it all unfold not with glee, but with a strange sort of stillness. I didn't feel triumph. I felt clarity. This wasn't revenge. This was gravity. This was what happens when you build a life on favoritism and entitlement and assume the person you're standing on will never push back. They didn't expect consequences because they never believed I had power. But walking away was power. Telling the truth was power. Choosing myself was power. They gambled on my silence. And they lost. The morning of my wedding felt impossibly calm. The kind of stillness you don't expect after chaos. The kind of peace that doesn't come from silence, but from certainty. The sky outside the window was bright, a soft golden light pouring in across the hardwood floors of the suite where I stood barefoot, wrapped in a silk robe, watching the city wake up beneath me. There was a breeze that made the curtains shift gently, and for a moment, I just stood there, breathing. No phones buzzing. No relatives bickering. No one hovering with last-minute complaints. Just light. Just air. Just quiet. Everything was intentional. Every detail. Every person in the room. Carter's mother moved gracefully, with a steady warmth that never felt forced. She wasn't trying to fill a role that wasn't hers, she simply showed up, fully present, and in doing so, she gave me the motherly calm I never really had. She helped me zip the back of my dress with hands that didn't tremble, eyes kind and proud but never overbearing. She didn't give a speech about how I looked. She didn't remind me of all the things that could still go wrong. She just said, softly, "You look exactly like yourself. And that's perfect." Aunt Lorraine was there too. She arrived early, dressed in a shade of blue that matched the accent stones on my earrings, her hands already reaching for the veil before I even asked. She'd been my mother's older sister, but the difference between them was always night and day. Lorraine never judged me. She never picked sides. She just listened. And when she pinned the veil into place with a few quiet adjustments and a smile that didn't hide tears, I felt the grief of everything I'd lost ease into something softer. She whispered, she'd be so proud, and I knew she meant Grandma. There were no photographers barking directions. No bridesmaids picked for optics. Just two of my closest friends adjusting my dress, laughing gently about how Carter would probably cry before I did, and asking me if I'd remembered to eat. I had. The bakery had delivered fresh lemon cake pastries to the suite that morning, and I'd eaten one while sitting cross-legged in my robe, the tangy sweetness reminding me so vividly of spring mornings with my grandmother that I had to pause and swallow twice before continuing. When the moment finally came, when I stood behind the heavy ballroom doors and heard the soft strains of our string quartet playing the opening notes of the song I'd chosen months ago, one my mother said was too unconventional, I didn't feel fear or nerves. I felt ready. Carter was already waiting. I could feel it, even before I saw him. That steady, anchoring presence I had come to depend on, not because I needed saving, but because he never once asked me to be less in order to be loved. The doors opened. The light hit me first, flooding through the tall windows, spilling over the gold-trimmed marble, catching on the brass accents and dancing over the faces of people who were actually happy to be there. No one had been invited out of obligation. There were no social puppets clinking glasses just to be seen. Every person in that room had made the list because they had walked with us through something real. Because they showed up when it mattered. Carter's eyes found mine almost immediately. He didn't try to hide the way they welled up. His jaw tightened the way it always did when he was trying to stay composed, but the emotion was right there, raw and unfiltered. He looked like someone who had found what he'd spent years hoping existed, and knew not to take it for granted. When we met at the altar, neither of us rushed. We just stood there, breathing the same air, hands meeting halfway, fingers locking in a way that felt like an answer. The officiant began, but the words barely registered. Not because they didn't matter, but because what mattered was already happening between us in silence. When it was time for the vows, I didn't read from a card. I had written something, but in the moment, I spoke from the part of myself I had fought to protect. My voice was steady, not because I wasn't emotional, but because I had never been more certain of anything. You made me believe I deserved to be someone's first choice, I said, and the tears came, not from sadness, but from the weight of every moment in my life when I hadn't believed it. Every time I had told myself to settle. Every time I had been told, directly or indirectly, that love meant disappearing a little to make someone else shine. Carter didn't speak right away. He just looked at me like there was no one else in the world. And when he did speak, his voice cracked, but he didn't stop. I don't care what we build, he said. As long as it's built with you. I heard someone sob softly in the third row. I saw Lorraine dab her eyes. Carter's mother smiled through her tears. And I stood there, grounded in the middle of a ceremony that had once been stolen and now stood fully reclaimed. No one mentioned my parents. No one brought up Brianna. No one asked where they were or why they hadn't come. Their absence was not a shadow. It was a cleansing. Not a hole, but a clearing. The space they had once taken up was now filled with air and light and the kind of love that doesn't make demands. The kind that says, you are enough. When the ceremony ended and we walked back down the aisle, hand in hand, the applause was warm, real, and close. There was no orchestra. No fireworks. No spectacle. Just people who loved us, clapping with the kind of joy that made the room vibrate with something ancient and human and true. I never looked back. Not once. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't wondering what I had missed or what version of myself I had failed to be. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Fully present. Fully chosen. Fully free. A few weeks after the wedding, after the thank you cards were sent and the last of the flowers had been dried and boxed into keepsakes, I heard about Brianna's post. I didn't follow her anymore, hadn't in months, but word still traveled fast in the overlapping circles of shared acquaintances, old classmates, and distant family friends. She'd written some long-winded caption beneath a filtered photo of her sitting alone in a white sundress, backlit like a martyr, a glass of wine posed just so. It was the kind of post designed to be screenshotted. Designed to stir sympathy. Designed to frame a narrative where she was the victim and I had been cruel. In the post, she wrote about family fractures, about the heartbreak of being abandoned by someone I thought would stand beside me no matter what. She wrote about how money can ruin people, and how jealousy poisons relationships. She never said my name, but everyone knew. It was a performance, like everything she did, a carefully curated piece of self-pity wrapped in poetic phrasing. She called it a season of loss. She alluded to being betrayed by blood. And for a split second, I braced myself. Because I remembered how easily people used to believe her. How quickly they accepted the version of events she spun, because it was easier to nod along with a polished story than ask difficult questions. I had seen it happen 100 times before, how her tears created shields, how her helplessness translated into credibility. But this time was different. This time, people didn't just watch. They started asking questions. They started commenting, gently at first. I heard the money wasn't actually hers. Didn't your sister's name appear on that trust fund? Weren't there legal documents involved? And then the comments became less gentle. You stole her wedding fund and played the victim? Your sister got married and you tried to ruin it online? Tell the whole story or don't tell it at all. She tried to moderate them. Deleted the worst ones. Turned off comments entirely for a while. Then she posted again, doubling down, claiming the truth was more complicated than outsiders could ever understand. But the cracks were already showing. People remembered. People talked. Some of those people had been at my wedding. Others had known my grandmother. A few were in the legal field and knew what it meant when a trust was misused, even by family. The narrative didn't hold. And slowly, what had once been their sanctuary, their community of polished friendships and performative social ties, began to turn cold. My mother stopped receiving invitations. Her name was quietly removed from charity event rosters and women's brunch groups. The boutique hotel where she had hosted her interior design showcases said they were fully booked indefinitely. She tried to act like it didn't bother her, but I heard from someone who saw her leave an event early, sunglasses on indoors, her smile tight and brittle. My father, who had always walked into rooms with a booming voice and the kind of authority that made people step aside, began fading into the background. He took a sabbatical that quietly became semi-retirement. The hospital didn't ask him back. The phone calls slowed. The speaking invitations stopped. They thought they could outmaneuver the truth. They thought they could guilt me back into submission. That if they made themselves small enough, wounded enough, I would break. That I would reach out and offer them a way back. But I didn't. I stayed silent. I didn't post. I didn't comment. I didn't argue. I didn't correct the narrative or try to explain my side. Because I didn't need to. The truth had already done its work. And for once, I didn't feel the pull to protect them from the consequences they created. I didn't feel the ache to fix things or soften the blow. I let it happen. I watched the house of cards fall and didn't try to gather the pieces. Because this was what they chose. They chose to steal from me. They chose to lie, to manipulate, to humiliate. They chose to pretend that I was the problem, and they did it assuming I would never hold the line. They believed silence was permanent. They believed obedience was a personality trait. But the day I chose to walk away was the day they lost the version of me that made their lives convenient. The version that flinched. The version that made excuses. The version that came back, no matter how many times she was pushed aside. And now, when they looked around and saw what remained, it wasn't abandonment they felt. It was consequence. The loneliness they faced wasn't something I inflicted, it was what they earned. And they didn't lose me because of money. They lost me the moment they decided I wasn't worth protecting. It's been 2 years now, and I no longer measure my life by what was taken from me. I measure it by what I finally allowed myself to claim. Peace. Autonomy. Love that never demands smallness. It's strange how much can change when you stop asking people to value you, and instead decide to live as if you already are. Our daughter was born in early spring, just as the trees outside our bedroom window were beginning to bloom. We named her Lorraine. Not because it was trendy or poetic, but because it was honest. Because when the world around me felt small and brittle, when my mother was rewriting history and my father was pretending betrayal was just strategy, it was Aunt Lorraine who stood beside me with quiet strength. She was the only one from that side of my family who didn't ask me to make myself palatable, didn't ask me to forgive before I was ready, didn't imply that survival had to come wrapped in grace. She just showed up, again and again, without expectation. And now, her name lives in the mouth of the child I carried into a world far freer than the one I came from. Carter became a father the same way he became a partner, with steady hands, unwavering presence, and a kind of love that isn't loud, but unmistakable. The first time he held Lorraine, he didn't say anything at all. He just looked down at her with that same expression he wore when I walked toward him on our wedding day, reverent, grounded, grateful. She looks like him, his eyes, his expression when she's focused, but her mouth is mine. She has my grandmother's dimples, and sometimes when the light hits her at a certain angle, I swear I can see every woman who held me up living in her tiny face. My parents have never met her. There was never a conversation about it. No dramatic disowning, no final confrontation. Just absence. A vacuum where entitlement used to be. After the wedding fell apart and the truth circled through every social group they used to orbit, they tried to rebrand. My mother made a few vague posts about estranged daughters and healing journeys. My father gave cold nods to anyone who asked where I'd gone. And Brianna, last I heard, was working reception at a dentist's office in the suburbs, her engagement a distant memory, her curated digital life now reduced to filtered brunches and reposted quotes about trusting the process. We haven't spoken. And the silence? It feels like air. Clean, unfiltered, breathable. Sometimes, when I'm rocking Lorraine to sleep and the apartment is still, I remember those early days. The living room confrontation. Carter's ultimatum. The cold phone call at hour 92. I remember the feeling of being made small, of being told that love was conditional, that worth was negotiable. And I remember what it cost to walk away. $50,000. That's the number people always return to. As if that's what the story was about. As if the betrayal could be quantified on a balance sheet. But it never was about the money. It never was about a wedding. It was about the story they tried to write for me. About the role I was expected to play and the way they reacted when I refused. It was about all the birthdays, all the graduations, all the quiet moments where I was told, in 1,000 small ways, that I was second. That I would always be second. That I should be grateful just to be included. And when I finally stepped outside of that framework, when I chose to write my own life with my own hand, that was the unforgivable act. Not defiance. But freedom. They thought the wedding was the war. They thought the venue, the vendors, the guest list, that's where the battle began and ended. But the truth is, that day was just the first time I let the world see what I'd known in my bones for years. That I deserved to be chosen. That being loved shouldn't come with conditions. That silence isn't strength, it's survival in disguise. And I was done surviving. Carter and I live in a space filled with warmth. It's not extravagant, but it's ours. There are pictures of us on the walls, unposed, real. There are stacks of books on the shelves and toys scattered across the floor. There is laughter that isn't performative. There are dinners that aren't rehearsed. And when I wake up beside him, when I watch Lorraine sleep with one tiny hand curled beside her cheek, I don't think about what I lost. I think about what it cost to get here. $50,000. And I'd pay it again. 1,000 times over.